The Honourable Jim Anderson.
Mr Speaker, this budget signals that the National Party has decided to preside over a dying economy. Why? Because the most important social and economic investment in the future of any country is its investment in education. And we just heard the Maori Party congratulating itself on that. They should look at the facts. This budget says that in the 4 financial years coming up from 2011-12 to 2014-15, government investment in education will increase by $197 million over 4 years. That's less than $50 million a year. In a budget of $12,000 million, that is 0.004 of 1% increase in education in each of the next 4 years. If that's a triumph for the Maori Party, I'd hate to know what a failure might look like. And provision for welfare benefits, that's unemployment, sickness and invalids in the same period, is not $197 million. It is $3,153 million increase. $197 million for education, $3,153 million for unemployment, sickness and invalids benefits. That's why I say this government has decided to preside over a dying economy. Twice as much money provided for welfare benefits than the total provision for health and education combined. These facts would be simply ludicrous in any budget that offered itself for the future of the country if it wasn't so tragic. Mr Speaker, look at the economy this government inherited. In 2008, unemployment was the lowest in the OECD. It was 3.5% of the labour force. And because there were jobs, people moved off benefits in record numbers. In April 2008, just 3 years ago, 17% of children in New Zealand lived with someone who was reliant on a benefit. Today, after 2.5 years of a national government, unemployment is back up again to the levels last seen the last time they were in office in the 90s. Benefit numbers are up again as well because the real jobs aren't there. More than 32,000 more children are reliant on benefit families today than in April 2008. And because New Zealanders are not in work and earning money, the books have turned to a sea of red. In 2008, the government had a fiscal surplus of $2.7 billion. In the fiscal update just before the 2008 election, the government accounts were forecast to remain in surplus for the forecast period. The Crown was contributing to the superannuation fund and had no net debt whatever, none. Today, the government announced a fiscal deficit of $17 billion. But look where the deficit has come from. The income tax cuts on October the 1st last year cost $17.8 billion over 4 years. The top 10% of income earners alone got an income tax cut worth $44 million a week. I wonder how many of them are Maori. The government is borrowing $2.5 billion a year just for the tax cuts for the top 10% of income earners alone. This government likes to blame the state of its books on the previous government, and I'm sick of hearing it because it's simply not true. Their problem is they can't take personal responsibility. They've been there for 2.5 years. When on earth does the government start to have to put its hand up and say, it's us, not the other guys before us? And they have to find someone to blame because they can't fix the problems. So they blame the global crisis. They blame the earthquakes. Those events made things worse, that's true, but bad management has made the economy worse still. The national government was going to catch Australia. Bill English and John Key were going to close the wage gap with Australia. Yeah, right. Australia went through the global financial crisis just as we did. Australia has been hit by devastating national disasters too, like floods and the unprecedented hurricane in Queensland. But here's what the Australian Treasurer had to say about his budget delivered last week. Quote, "Our economy has been hit in the short term by the recent natural disasters which have devastated families and communities." But he went on, but growth is strengthening, unemployment is low and is set to fall even further. We've seen over 700,000 jobs created since we came to government. The National Party can't say that. They've lost jobs. And we expect to see a further 500,000 jobs added by mid-2013, and they're not all in the mining industry, I can tell you. Our public finances are in relatively good nick and we'll be back in the black in 2012-13. So much for New Zealand catching Australia. And all this government has to say about why they've weathered the storm is that Australia's got mining. So that's all there is to it. That ignores the fact that we have been enjoying the best commodity prices in our history. We've had the most favourable terms of trade in our history. No, the problem is that National has no idea how to fix the economy, and it still hasn't. And it announced that to us in bold terms today. John Key came into office promising tax cuts that everyone would share in, and promising that those tax cuts would help us catch Australia. Yeah, right. His government has failed on every one of its own targets. Most New Zealanders didn't get a net tax cut. They got a small cut that was cancelled out immediately by the rise in GST and the subsequent price rises that soared ahead of their incomes. Imagine if the National Party had produced an election manifesto in 2008 and said this: if you vote for us, we'll increase GST to 15%. We will cut working for families, we will cut student loans, and we'll give tax cuts costing $44 million a week to the top 10% of income earners. They wouldn't have dared set out that plan before the working people of New Zealand, but that's how they've governed. They got elected on promises they couldn't keep. Governments in the 80s and 90s did exactly that, and they got thrown out. And it's interesting that John Key wasn't here then. He was dealing in the money markets around the world, many of them speculating against the New Zealand dollar, as a matter of fact. National didn't trust New Zealanders enough before the election to tell them the truth, that tax cuts meant spending cuts and deficits. That's what they mean. And today they don't trust New Zealanders enough to tell them the truth about the cause of the deficits now. The sort of government that is too weak to front up to the truth is a government that is too weak to make the changes New Zealand needs. There's a predictable outcome to this failure. People suffer. And the more vulnerable they are, the less resilient they are, and the more they suffer. We had a health report on young children in New Zealand recently, and some parliamentarians went to it at a morning breakfast. This is what we found. Children are being admitted to hospital for diseases that are clearly linked to poverty in greater and greater numbers. There were an extra 6 hospital admissions for infectious diseases and respiratory diseases every single day in 2009 compared with 2 years before, and the figures are now worse. When families don't have adequate incomes and jobs, their children live in poor housing conditions and they lack nourishment and they're not warm enough. Their health suffers, their opportunities suffer even more. How much harder is it for children in the increasing thousands of poor homes this government has created than for a child in one of the affluent and privileged homes that are already heavily favoured? This government should be ashamed of itself in that regard. In 2008, the main breadwinner was unemployed in about 7% of Maori and Pacific families. Today, their figure has doubled. 14% of Maori and Pacific families don't have someone to work and bring home a wage or a salary. And I heard the Green Party, I have to say, applauding the Maori Party when they're telling how great they've done. They haven't done great at all. They've done appallingly badly. And that is the Maori Party's legacy for supporting National. They are deluding themselves that they think otherwise. And what does it mean in practice, Mr. Speaker? Half of the kids whose families are living in severe hardship have not got suitable wet weather gear because of the cost. A third of them don't have a pair of shoes in good condition. They miss out on the experience of growing up, like owning a bike or a personal computer. Their 2/3 miss out on school outings or involvement in sports. Half miss out on school books or a visit to the doctor because of the cost. None of those things are provided for in this budget. In fact, the health budget is an appalling document which shows that the health of New Zealanders in terms of primary health care in particular is going to go to hell in a handcart. Mr. Speaker, this budget is a return to the failed policies of the 90s, the policies that failed people then and they'll fail them again. they'll fail to create jobs, they'll fail to lift incomes, they'll fail to create a stronger future to New Zealand for New Zealanders. This is a miserable excuse for a budget and one of the worst I have ever seen in my experience in politics.
I call the Honourable Peter